introduce the interim president of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., Abigail Friedman. She's the founder and CEO of Wisteria Group, a consulting firm, and previously she was senior advisor to the Asia Foundation, where she led strategic engagement with Japan and advised on other conflict-afflicted regions in Asia. She also had a long career at the State Department, and Abigail's been a terrific leader at the Society, and it's great to welcome her here at Carnegie.
Thank you so much. It feels a little odd to introduce the introducer, but thank you all for coming here today. And we've got a great speaker who many of you already know because he's had such an illustrious career in the economic front. Masahiro Kawai-san, who will be speaking today about international and Asia trade dynamics in 2019. He's currently the representative director of ARENA, the Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia, which is based in Niigata, which I find kind of interesting because so often we just see things happening in Tokyo or Washington, D.C., that having someone who's based in a perspective outside of the main city is great. Kawai-san is, he's also a professor he's the representative director of the Economic Research Institute of Northeast Asia, but also a professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. He also served as previously as Deputy Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs at Japan's Ministry of Finance. He's a Stanford University graduate, has his master's and PhD in economics from Stanford. And he began his career as a research fellow at Brookings. Am I allowed to say that word here? And then he was an assistant and associate professor in the economics department at Johns Hopkins. Afterwards, he was a full professor at the University of Tokyo, and he also served during this time as a consultant at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and at the IMF in Washington, D.C. He's also worked as chief economist for the World Bank's East Asia and Pacific region from 1998 to 2001. And then subsequent to that, he was with the Ministry of Finance, the Japanese Ministry of Finance. He also joined the Asian Development Bank and served as head of the ADB's Office of Regional Economic Integration and special advisor to the ADB president in charge of regional economic cooperation and integration. He's published a number of books and numerous articles on economic globalization, on regional financial integration and cooperation in East Asia, including lessons from the Asian financial crisis and on the international currency system. So I think you can see from this brief bio that he has really covered all the bases on the economic front and on international trade. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Kawai.
Good afternoon. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to be here to talk about the Japan-U.S. Economic relations and the future of TPP 11. I think I want to get a bit closer to the slide, since I cannot, I don't have it just in front of me. Maybe the best way would be to, I see, okay, thank you very much. Oops. Okay, so President Trump withdrew from TPP on day 1 or 2 after assuming his presidency. And Japan started to lead negotiations on TPP 11. Japan was then the largest economy among the 11 countries. So Japan was a natural leader to do so. In the meantime, Mr. Trump started to focus on trade issues to reduce trade deficits, and particularly he focused on China, and he has been very tough on China, or people around him were probably tougher towards China than Mr. Trump himself. But Mr. Trump also wants to forge FTAs with or trade agreements with the EU and Japan, which would be very favorable from the U.S. perspective. And he has been using the threat of imposing additional tariffs on automobile imports. Japan now started to work with other 10 countries within the TPP 11 context to expand membership. Japan also came up with an EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, with the EU, and this EPA is going to be in force on February the 1st this year. And Japan has also been working with other East Asian countries to forge RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. So Japan under Mr. Abe has been working very intensively on mega FTAs and supporting the liberal trading system for not only Japan, but for Asia and for the world. So the question is, where do we go from here? Now, we know that the U.S. has the largest trade deficit with China, followed by the EU, Mexico, and Japan, according to the number for 2017. So Japan's trade surplus against the United States is not too gigantic in comparison to China's. But still, Mr. Trump wants to reduce deficits. Now, Japan has been pursuing its own FTA strategy and Abenomics as part of growth strategy. And the Japanese government has been making it clear that maintaining the rules-based liberal and multilateral world trading system under the WTO would be the most important strategy for Japan. For that purpose, Japan has been working with the EU, other G7 countries, and like-minded countries to support the multilateral trading system. And Japan has continued to try to convince the U.S. to return to this multilateral trading arrangement. The U.S., Mr. Trump, has complaints of WTO practices, and of course, WTO has many problems, and together with the U.S., it's very fortunate that Mr. Lighthizer does support WTO reform, and Japan, the EU, and the U.S. have been supporting WTO reform. Another important pillar of Japanese trade strategy is to convince China to return to reform and opening policy, which was so successful, but which was recently reversed towards more closed nature, and to shift away from the so-called state capitalism model to a truly market-oriented open economy development model. And also implementing several mega FTAs has been very important. That's why Mr. Abe wanted to revive TPP after Mr. Trump's withdrawal. Now, the data in the table are a bit old, but even though Japan has been integrating with many other Asian countries in terms of people's movement, trade, foreign direct investment, the role of China, for that matter, has become very important, and economic relationship with ROK continues to be very important, but you realize that the U.S. is also a very important economic partner for outbound international tourism and trade and foreign direct investment. So the U.S. is there economically in Japan. And Mr. Abe came up with a KPI, key performance indicator, with regards to its FTA strategy. Mr. Abe wanted to achieve the FTA trade coverage ratio of 70% by 2018, last year. This was not achieved, but still this policy continues to be important. So to achieve it, Japan has to forge an FTA with TPP 11 member countries and the US also, and EU, which will be realized very soon, and then Korea and China. So working with many countries continues to be quite important. Now, for this audience, I don't think there is really need to re-emphasize the strategic importance of TPP, but just I want to say that the TPP was a high standard FTA, including developing countries. So that was a very excellent attempt. Even by including developing countries, a very high standard FTA could be achieved. And actually TPP 11 has done so. And also TPP was intended to put pressure on China to further open up and to pursue further reform. So in the future, China could be invited to be a member of TPP. So in that sense, TPP was a very important instrument to encourage China to go through important structural reforms. But Mr. Trump decided not to use that path. But TPP 11 remains significant. TPP 11 was launched by 6 countries: Australia, Canada, Japan, Mexico, New Zealand, and Singapore. And also this month, Vietnam joined TPP 11. Okay? And 3 other countries, Brunei, Chile, and Peru, are now going through domestic procedures. Malaysia, another country, is a signatory member of TPP 11, is now considering what it should be doing. Hopefully, Malaysia will soon ratify, but we don't know. TPP 11 member countries suspended 22 provisions. And I have a list of suspended provisions and items under TPP 11. Most of the provisions and items suspended are related to intellectual property rights. About half of the 20, more than half of 20 suspended provisions are related to intellectual property. So basically, those provisions which the U.S. really insisted on putting into TPP, which many developing countries and even some developed countries like Australia and New Zealand did not quite appreciate, were put in place, but they were now suspended. They have been suspended. And so even though there are these suspended items, still TPP 11 can be a model for the 21st century trade and investment rules. And if the U.S. accepts the entirety of TPP text and does not demand anything more, and if the U.S. wants to come back, the U.S. can come back, and those suspended provisions would be restored. We may want to discuss later if the U.S. wants to do it, but if the U.S. wants to come back to TPP, will the U.S. accept the existing text of TPP? More likely, the U.S. would like to add something more to the text. Then there would have to be a lot of negotiations between the U.S. and existing members of TPP 11. Okay. There are still economic benefits to TPP 11, even though the U.S. is not there. So economic benefits are smaller than TPP, which includes the United States, but still there are economic benefits. Okay. Now, membership expansion for TPP 11. Japan and other TPP 11 member countries believe that membership expansion is going to send a strong message to the international community that these countries really care about liberal trading arrangement and multilateral system. But there are several issues. There are still countries which have not ratified TPP 11 those 3 countries plus Malaysia. And so if a new discussion starts with new potential members, then who should be more seriously negotiating with the new members? Only those members, those TPP 11 members which have become legitimate members, or would that include other TPP members which have not ratified? Okay. Those countries which have not ratified may be concerned about new members coming into members of TPP 11 because that may create competitive pressure for the countries which have not ratified. Another question is, should a very high standard be required in terms of tariff reduction, tariff elimination? Would looser agreement be possible? You may remember tariff discussions are done on a bilateral basis. So between any 2 countries, there may be a lot of concessions given to particular countries. So there is some unclarity about the direction towards tariff or market access issues. Although trade and investment rules of TPP 11 would have to be accepted by new members. And also it may take some time to finalize TPP 11 expansion. There are several countries which have expressed interest to become TPP 11 members, like Colombia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Taiwan, the UK. China has not expressed interest, but China may be a future member, even the EU. But these countries do have various domestic issues. Colombia, after the new government, doesn't seem to be too keen. There is some uncertainty about Colombia's direction. Thailand and Indonesia will go through go through elections. So we have to wait after the election outcomes are known. The Philippines, so the Philippines may be concerned about its economic and political relationship with China under the current president. Taiwan has been expressing very strongly to join TPP and also TPP 11, but TPP 11 members may be concerned about possible conflict with China. You remember in the case of WTO entry, China insisted that China should enter the WTO first and then Taiwan. Okay. Now, China and EU may be good candidates, but is it really a good idea to invite them in the absence of the United States? So there are many issues to think about. Now, prospects for RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is an ASEAN-centered FTA among 16 countries, the 10 ASEAN member states, plus Japan, China, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. So RCEP is not as ambitious as TPP or TPP-11, but it's a very important mega FTA because it does include China and India, and also a large country like Indonesia. Differences among the major countries are large, initially between Japan and China on the level of tariff reduction and trade and investment rules. But after the start of U.S.-China trade war, China has softened. China wants to strengthen economic friendship with the neighboring countries. But India has been a reluctant member. RCEP also generates a lot of economic benefits, mainly because China's level of protection is still high and India's level of protection very high. Now, RCEP negotiations, now out of the total 19 chapters, 7 chapters have been basically agreed on. So some progress is going on, but there are difficult chapters, which are market access issues. In particular, India is very much afraid of the negative impact of trade liberalization on domestic industries, because already cheap Chinese products are now flowing into India, and India would be further exposed to Chinese products. Intellectual property, e-commerce, these are difficult issues, and differences in views among countries relatively large. But negotiation will likely be concluded this year. China's softening position, and of course it depends on India's election outcome. Hopefully Modi continues to be supported. India can be more forthcoming, because a lot of more time and leeways are provided to India under RCEP. After all, India's per capita income, per capita GDP is about the same as CLMV countries. So treat India just like Cambodia and Laos. So India should be able to come. My paper contains RCEP chapters and some progress made. Highlighted part, it's a difficult part. Okay. Now, so next likely steps. So TPP 11 is now in place, and a lot of progress will be made on RCEP, which would include, as I said, China and India. Now, just in a minute or so, what are the prospects of TAG or U.S. JTA negotiation? Japan calls this Japan-U.S. trade negotiation TAG, trade agreement on goods. The U.S. calls it U.S.-Japan trade agreement. So there is some difference in approach. Major issues between the U.S. and Japan are autos and agricultural sector problems. The U.S. runs large trade deficits in automobiles, accounting for about 3/4 of total U.S. bilateral deficits vis-a-vis Japan. I have some data. So automotive vehicles, parts, and engines had a trade deficit for the U.S. of $53 billion. Total trade deficit on goods for the U.S. Was about $70 billion. So the automotive part is the most important part. So Mr. Trump wants to reduce this deficit. But that's very difficult. Japan imports a very small amount of American automobiles, and Japan exports a massive amount. How can this be adjusted? It's going to be very difficult. Agricultural trade is also an important part, but the U.S. runs a surplus on foods, feeds, and beverages. Okay? And the U.S. wants to increase this part, trade surplus on agricultural products. And also the U.S. is indicating a possible currency clause. Now, looking at the new NAFTA arrangement and an ongoing discussion about the nature of U.S.-EU trade negotiation, the U.S. could demand a lot of things. So there are several key issues for the U.S.-Japan negotiation. From the Japanese perspective, there are several things that should be avoided. Very restrictive trade policies against Japanese auto imports. This is something that needs to be avoided, like an increase in tariffs. Mr. Trump threatens, or setting a numerical limit on imports of Japanese autos in a binding way. In the case of a new NAFTA, it's not binding, but in the future, the limit may bind. But we are very much concerned about the introduction of a binding limit. Or the U.S. may want to set a very high rules of origin requirement for auto trade between the two countries. In the case of new NAFTA agreement, the rules of origin requirement was increased. And currency clauses, which may have implications for monetary policy, should be avoided because Japanese monetary policy continues to be expansionary, and there is no possibility at this point to exit from this ultra easy monetary policy. And it's very vital for Japan to maintain independent monetary policy. And Japan will be ready to accept a comprehensive FTA deal, not simply on goods, services, investment, other issues. And Japan can import more shale gas. And also earlier there was a discussion on the imports of military equipments, which Japan is doing. And Japan can further open the agricultural market to the extent of original TPP and Japan-EU EPA deals. Maybe Japan could go a bit more if necessary. Japan can invest more in auto plants in the United States to expand automobile industry capacity in the United States. So my conclusion, Mr. Trump has been very tough against China, but so far against Canada, Mexico, the EU, and Japan, the U.S. has been less tough, which is good. But the U.S., EU, and Japan need to make concerted efforts to work on China, to induce changes in China. So the U.S. must work with the EU and Japan and other like-minded countries. And also they have to work together to implement WTO reform in an effective way. But of course, this process would have to involve China. And Japan and other TPP 11 member countries will start membership expansion. And Japan, China, and other members will likely reach an early conclusion of RCEP this year. And Japan can contribute to the U.S. economy by keeping to try to convince the U.S. that a free and multilateral trading system is the best. And by purchasing more goods from the U.S. and investing more in the auto and other key manufacturing sectors in the U.S. And of course, Japan and the U.S. share a lot of common interests going beyond bilateral trade. China's change, China's reform, North Korean issue, and free and open Indo-Pacific initiative to give economic substance to this Indo-Pacific initiative would be very, very important. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Kawai. That was really quite excellent. And I sort of wish we had a crystal ball and we could say, okay, so what does the future look like for this and for that? We will open up for questions, but I will, in the tradition here, ask the first one. It's been interesting to me to watch the U.S. domestic approach to TPP, as we all know, was great resistance. This wasn't just something that President Trump was against, but there was a bipartisan grassroots opposition, which eventually killed TPP for the U.S. Japan historically had a very powerful grassroots lobby that resisted international agreements. And yet here we now see Japan taking the lead on TPP, signing the EU-Japan FTA, engaging with RCEP. What's the magic that's working that is making this possible in Japan? What's the Japanese public reaction to this? What is the business community reaction to this? Why is this working?
Okay. Professor Takeuchi also discussed this issue earlier. Well, Japan had 2 decades of economic stagnation, and everybody understands that Japan should get out of long-term economic stagnation. Otherwise, the Japanese debt would continue to expand relative to GDP, and social security system could be under stress. To avoid it, economic growth is needed. Opening, market opening, and more proactively participating in the global economic management would be quite important and is necessary. And I think that's been accepted by the majority of people. And the only sector that has been complaining, well, I should say almost the only sector, is the agricultural lobby. But the Japanese government has been spending a lot of money for TPP itself, and Japan, EU, EPA, now preparing for TPP 11, and even preparing for the U.S., Japan-U.S. Trade negotiation. In order to give comfort to the agricultural sector, a lot of fiscal money has been spent. And at the same time, a lot of reform pressure has been applied to the agricultural sector. Junior Koizumi, the son of former Prime Minister Koizumi, has been very active on agricultural reform. And so a combination of these has been working very well. And general population of Japan is supporting Japan's openness.
Thank you. I won't be selfish, so I will open it up now to questions from the audience. Please, Jim.
Jim Zumwalt, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. Thank you very much, Professor Kawai, for that really good tour of Japan's trade policy. My question concerns your comment on TPP or CPTPP expansion, where you mentioned that Taiwan's accession would be difficult because of China. So my question is, are you saying that China effectively has a veto power over who joins an organization that it is not in? Or do you think that Japan, recognizing that CPTPP expansion without Taiwan would lead to marginalization of Taiwan, and that's not in Japan's interest, so Japan will stand up to this pressure?
Well, ideally, we want China to be in TPP. We want the U.S., both the U.S. and China to be in TPP, or in a future sort of reformed TPP. If the U.S. wants to come in the future, the U.S. may want to demand a bit more. But in principle, TPP would be very useful for the U.S. and China. So we want China to be in. So TPP 11 inviting Taiwan first may alienate China, may give another reason for China to be hostile towards TPP or TPP 11. That's the reality. So it's not an easy decision, but hopefully in the future, when China joins, Taiwan will also join. But changing this order can upset China, which we don't want to see.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Russ Deming at SAIS. Thank you very much for your presentation. You made a brief reference in one of your graphs to the Japan ROK China trilateral trade negotiations, but no other elaboration. Is that alive? Is that going on? And where does that fit into our RCEP and TPP 11?
Okay, thank you very much. The so-called CJK FTA negotiation has been going on, but negotiators are now putting a lot of efforts on RCEP. The strategy for Japan is after RCEP, CJK should be more intensively pursued and in a deeper way. Going very deep at RCEP would be very difficult because of India, because of other countries like CL, Cambodia, Laos, and a few other countries. But on China, Japan, Korea, they can go deep. So for RCEP, the agreement may be shallow and not so satisfactory from the perspective of economists like myself, for many people. But I think first it will be useful to lock in China into a multilateral agreement and seek avenue for the next step for CJK. So there, China and Japan can talk about much deeper issues, SOE, reform issues, e-commerce, international, cross-border transfer of data, and so the CJK would be, the role of CJK is clearly there.
Thank you, Kawai sensei. Mikio Sugeno, and I have a question for the expansion of the TPP. You wrote in a presentation that we have a question whether it is appropriate to call China or UK or EU to be a further membership of the TPP. It's just so can I say question, but I'd like to know your answer. And secondly, can you say, I'm curious, how probable would be the case that the EU, after the hypothetically, after the hard Brexit, so to be a member of the TPP and EU as well? Thank you. How much percentage?
Okay, I answered on Taiwan. Taiwan should come after China. So that would be a very, very long-term project. China, this is a difficult issue, but we can openly invite China to start negotiation on TPP 11. I think that would give a good indication about China's willingness to change. So we should have many ways to induce China to change through WTO reform, through unilateral pressure from the U.S., multilateral process, plurilateral process. I think using many ways would be useful. So inviting China to TPP 11 would be one of them. But the U.S. may not be happy, and this new NAFTA's poison bill clause on non-market economy. So the U.S. may be concerned, but this is something I want to advocate. EU, I am more positive towards inviting EU, discussing, connecting TPP 11 and EU, and forging a very large FTA, mega FTA. And hopefully this would have some impact on U.S. trade policy to induce the U.S. to think about coming back to multilateral arrangement. So I think TPP 11 has a lot of potential to change China, to change the U.S., and in a positive way. We are not destroying the world. We are trying to help reconstruct liberal, multilateral trading system for the world. Well, I think current TPP 11 members have to start negotiations with few potential member countries. And then the Brexit, what's going to happen to Brexit has to be observed. And of course, the UK can be a very strong member country, strong candidate for membership expansion, and the EU also. So I cannot quite assign probability, but I hope TPP 11 member countries would consider linking with the EU very, very seriously.
Professor Kawai, Marilyn Myers, retired Foreign Service officer. Two rather brief questions. The first one is about the trade deficit with Japan. I find it really striking that 30 years on from when I was in Tokyo, auto exports continue to be sort of the bugbear in the relationship. And of course, the answer then was many of the Japanese companies started to invest here. Honda went into Ohio, Toyota went into Kentucky, et cetera. I wonder if you could tell me at this point in time, approximately what percentage of the Japanese cars sold in the U.S. market are made in the U.S. versus made in Japan. And the second very short question is, one of your charts showed the difference in projected economic growth if the U.S. was in the TP or without the U.S. being a member. And it seems the only country rather dramatically that had a much bigger economic growth forecast if the U.S. was not in was New Zealand. And I wonder if you could comment on why that is so. Thank you.
If I understand it correctly, the first question is what percentage of cars made in the U.S. or Japanese cars are made in the U.S. as opposed to made in Japan and exported into the U.S.?
Okay. About, I think, about half imported from Japan. Sorry, about half imported from Japan and half imported from Canada, Mexico, and domestically produced. I think that's roughly speaking.
Manny Manriquez from the Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association. I'll give you a few stats here. It's 50% roughly that are sold in the U.S. or built in the U.S. Another 25% or so built in Canada and Mexico and imported to the U.S. And about the rest of the about a quarter, 25%.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
So you got the answer right. You got an A on the exam.
Okay.
Important facts for this crowd to know here. So.
Okay, thank you. Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Yeah. What was the second question? Somebody? Yeah. 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 So somebody wants to help? Okay. Okay. Great.
Some of the major concessions Japan made on agricultural products are products where the United States, New Zealand, and Australia are all competitive. So by removing the United States from the agreement, particularly Japan has some quotas. And so if the United States does not compete for that quota, that is a huge advantage for countries like Australia and New Zealand. So I'm guessing that's the reason for the change.
Thank you.
You get an A too, Jim. Okay. Let's see. Do we have time for one more very brief question? Thank you.
I'm Hiroki Takeuchi at SMU. I agree with your argument of encouraging using TPP to encourage China for more reforms and especially SOE reforms. But when we talk about it, TPP includes the rules of state-owned enterprise and also intellectual property rights, and then that's actually usually the issue of our complaint. Now you say that many of the rules of the intellectual property rights and SOE are kind of suspended. So do you think still CPTPP is a good tool to encourage China for reform?
Yes, still TPP 11 would be great. So about 11 provisions have been suspended with regard to intellectual property, but that's okay. That's okay. SOE, making sure that the level playing field would be maintained for SOEs. Subsidies and favorable treatments of SOEs should be dismantled under TPP 11. Malaysia made a request for a change for the petrol SOE, Petronas. But that was the only exception. China may want to ask for exceptions, but too many exceptions, cannot be accepted. And I think TPP 11 is actually maybe better for China than TPP 12, where the US is in, because then US-China confrontation would become the issue. Now, in the absence of the US, China can change, and China can show to the US and the rest of the world that China can change. I think that would be very useful. Of course, over how many years change should take place may be the subject matter of negotiation. But I think even including that, if China comes to the table of TPP 11 membership expansion, I think that would provide a very productive opportunity for everybody.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I have really enjoyed this conversation and lecture. So please join me in welcoming and thanking Professor Kawai. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kawai Sensei and Abigail. I appreciate that. We're going to make a very quick switch over to the final panel. We'll get a couple of waters up here and some new nameplates. That was I did enjoy how the professor got the whole class involved there. That was good. This is a good time to mention a couple of the things that the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. does and contributes to the area. In addition to this event, of course, its big signature event is the Sakura Matsuri, the kind of centerpiece of the Cherry Blossom Festival every spring. Also runs the Japan Bowl, Japan language competition for high school students around the region, but around the country as well. And Japan in a Suitcase, an education program at elementary schools and other schools in the area. Cinematsuri, the Japanese Film Festival. So there's a whole range of things that the Japan-America Society does here in Washington. Can we get just a couple nameplates?
And if you want to become a member.
Oh, here, I'll give you the microphone.
No, you did a great job.
Okay, Abigail is the one to see for membership. Oh, and of course, Japanese language instruction. Oh, I'm standing in front of. So my effort to be a good citizen is actually preventing us from moving on. Yeah. Why don't we? I'll invite our second panel to join. This will be moderated by Matt Goodman, who's back with us, and he'll introduce the panelists. Shihoko here. Let me take a look. Okay, bear with us just a minute. We might move to handheld microphones here. I could make a joke about the Chinese manufacturer of microphones, but I'm not going to. Got them coming up.
There we go. That sounds good, promising. Okay, while they're getting theirs set up, I'll get started. Welcome back, or if you were here for Kawai-san's presentation, then we're carrying on. My name is Matthew Goodman. Again, I'm the chairman of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., and delighted to have all of you with us again if you weren't here first thing this morning when I was here earlier. I understand we had a good discussion on the domestic panel. This is the international panel, in case you think you're supposed to be somewhere else. We're going to talk about Japanese foreign policy, the U.S. Japan alliance, issues in the Indo-Pacific region, and anything else that our panelists decide is interesting or that you want to ask about. For about the next hour and a half. So we'll go until 3:30 and then we'll conclude. So I have a great panel here, and I think these people are well known to this audience, but I'll move down the line from my left, your right. Toshihiro Nakayama is a Japan Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Asia program. He's also professor in the Policy Management faculty at Keio University in Tokyo, and he is an adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs. He focuses on American politics and foreign policy, and international U.S.-Japan relations, international relations more broadly. I think he's well known, again, to this audience as a real pro and expert in the issues we're going to be talking about today. So delighted to have Nakayama-sensei. Next to him is Shihoko Goto, who is a colleague at also the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're not deliberately here tilting the field towards the Woodrow Wilson Center, but we're delighted they've got such great expertise. She's Senior Northeast Asia Associate there and is an expert on Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Northeast Asia, let's call it broadly. She was a journalist for a decade writing about the international political economy with an emphasis on Asian markets. She's done a diverse set of work in political economy, my home area as well, and so we've got a lot in common and a lot to talk about. So delighted to have you with us, Shihoko. And then at the end is Eric Altbach, who works for Albright Stonebridge Group. Eric is a former official at USTR. He also worked at the White House. In fact, he was both my predecessor and my successor at the White House, which is a neat trick, if you can pull that off. And they couldn't live without it, basically. And so delighted to have Eric with us. He is an expert on Japan. He did a lot of work on China and Taiwan when he was at USTR and covers those parts of the world as well. So we've got a great group here, tilted a little towards economic issues. That wasn't deliberate, and we'll try to what I'll try to do is maybe broadly divide the conversation into economic and other issues, but they're going to blend together, I'm sure, in people's initial remarks. So what I thought we'd do as a start is to ask, maybe that's interrupting with if we turn off all our phones up here, that may be interrupting with the disturbing the signal. So I'll do that as well. I'll ask Professor Nakayama to start and give us some overviews on the kind of the big challenges in the region from an international perspective and what is facing Japan and what Abe-san's priorities are going to be this year.
Okay, thanks for having me here. A bit about a different subject that we touched upon this morning about the name of the era. I think you focused on this newness and Sheila said freshness, but I think it's going to be more about calm and peace. because Heisei was a very rocky era for Japan, right? It started out as a bubble, it bursted, we had March 11. So I think something that sort of symbolizes peace and calm would be, right. And this is very important for Japan. How this name of the era, how it sort of penetrate the Japanese vernacular. Like when I'm at a university, I will be labeled as a Showa guy, a very old guy. I know there's some Keio students there. You know, they would make fun of me as a Showa guy. But now that I can make fun of them, that they're the Heisei guy. So it's just very important. And this is a sort of like a spiritual, it's not psychological, I would say more spiritual rebirth. So I think it's symbolically very important in looking at 2019. And secondly, I found out a very interesting poll on Nikkei, in fact. And it says that, you know, what is Japan's strength? Right? It says technology is at the highest, at near 80%. But if you look at the lower end, it's the language, politics, diplomacy, and military and security, right? They're all under 10%. That's a tough number, I think. So we have to sort of keep that in mind as well. And then I'll go jump into the topic I was given, Japan's foreign policy in U.S. and Japan. I think we're extremely lucky that we had Prime Minister Abe as our leader in this rocky times. Because prior to Prime Minister Abe, I was sort of made fun of by my American friends as Japan being a failed state, right, politically. Because we're having this leadership change almost every year for like 5, 6 years. Right? So Professor Takeuchi sort of emphasized that, this continuation of Abe. And his initiative on sort of national security infrastructure. The fact that he came out with this national security strategy is quite important because drafting a national security strategy is an effort to, it's a narrative to shape the desirable kind of all that you want in our region. And Japan was never known for these kind of shaping attitude. But now we have this, FOIP, right? And other sort of conceptual framework that defines, Japan's foreign policy. And I think that's based on the institutional change that Prime Minister Abe undertook. So we're, I think, extremely lucky that we had Prime Minister Abe. But my role here is not just to praise him. So I guess I should
not
be—
to bury him either.
Not to bury him either, right? So Japan is expected to play a role of, upholding this liberal international order with some others. But in Asia Pacific, almost alone, Japan is seen as a guardian. Maybe on the economic front, to a certain extent, I think it has a rationale. But when it comes to sort of political security, and especially like on the human rights front, it's going to be very difficult for sort of Japan to take that sort of role of the guardian of liberal international order. So we should be a bit cautious about relying too much on Japan. And then now, on the state of the U.S.-Japan relationship, I think it's a sort of like a double-edged sword. For Japan, there's no other options, right? If we think about the fact that we're facing a rising China, a threat on the Korean Peninsula, we have no other options but to sort of beef up and sort of double down on the U.S.-Japan security alliance, no matter who the president is. You chose it, we deal with him, no matter who, right? It's not our fault, right? So you can't criticize Japan for being friendly with any administration. So I think that's the basic position. But that doesn't mean that we are not
working again, so you can use that one now.
So on the trade front, as other panelists explained, we are sort of nervous about it, starting of the negotiations this year about U.S.-Japan sort of trade talks. And also this general mood, I think Sheila touched upon a bit in the opening, that there's this sense of rising retrenchment. Why does U.S. has to be there? Right? If you talk to sort of the Washington foreign policy establishment types, you're worrying too much. America is always there. It's a resident power. But you see this retrenchment not just on the Republican side, right? But you see that on the Democratic side as well. I don't say it's a consensus. Maybe I may be overreacting a bit, but we see that because U.S. is the only option we have at the moment, right? So you can't criticize for us being too worried about it. And there is a consensus in Japan that we have to sort of double down on the alliance. So if you ask the Japanese public, do you support the alliance? People will answer like 90% in support, right? And 90% is not a number what you usually get in a democracy. So it's a very strong support, but I think like the content of that support is changing a little bit. Because there are doubts in Japan, like I said, about U.S. commitment to the region, whether you will be a resident power in the region in the longer context. So I call that like the shogunai mentality within the sort of support, support base is, I think, increasing. So although Japan is among the major Western nations, Japan is the most comfortable nation with President Trump and his team. I think this notion that U.S. is potentially an epicenter of world uncertainty and instability is having a big sort of a psychological effect on Japanese. And I think in particular to the younger generation, I think it's having a strong impact on them. So we're not hedging, but searching for other partners, like in Australia, India, and we're trying to inviting UK to our region. They're feeling a bit lonely now, so they're willing to partner up with us. France, for that matter, we have this 2+2 dialogue between France as well, but that would not sort of take place the role that U.S.-Japan alliance is playing, because Indian Navy would never come to the East China Sea and deal with the situation that might arise. And there's also this theory that even Japan is hedging. Look at Prime Minister Abe going to China. And probably Xi Jinping is going to visit Japan sometime this spring, or maybe a bit later than that. But I don't buy that argument, because Japan-China relation, PRC relations, in the past 10 years was really bad, right? It was like -10. So this effort is just bringing it up to like -1 or 0. So I don't think you should treat it as Japan hedging, because even Japan can't trust the U.S. Right? We took sides. I think that's the correct depiction. With ROK, it is extremely difficult. We used to call our relations with, or how we see South Korea, as being we're too tired. So Korean fatigue was the key word in trying to explain how we approach South Korea. But now some of my colleagues, who is not like the typical anti-Korean types, would say distrust. Right? We don't want to talk with them anymore. There's no use. So that kind of mentality is increasing, and I'm extremely worried. And this is not just because of the history issues, I think. And history issue has never been purely about history issues. It was always more than that. So there was this strategic sort of understanding that if you look at the future of Korea's position in East Asia, which is important, Japan or United States, Japan or China, we feel that they see China as playing a more important role in the future. Between U.S. and China, Koreans think that they can balance, right, between the two. But if it's China and Japan, it's China. That's the kind of, I don't know whether this analysis is correct or not, But that's the kind of feeling that is rising in Japan. I'm going over time a bit, so I'll quit. So the state of the alliance is, I think, A-OK, quite good. Maybe among the policy people, even better during the Obama administration. Right? That's the exception. No one thinks that way around the world, but Japan does. The alliance is in a better state than in the Obama administration. But this alliance doesn't exist in a vacuum. Right? It only functions when U.S. is fully committed to the region and when U.S. has an East Asian policy, which we don't quite see. So yes, the alliance is okay, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So I'm not extremely comfortable or optimistic about how alliance would kick in when it needs to function to deal with a situation. Your election is coming back. Japan is known to be the 51st state. It may be the most reddest state among the 51 states. That's how I'm joking a bit, but this time around, there's a high probability that it may flip, right? And the new and incoming Democrats are not totally new, but many of them are so new, and we don't have the connection to them. So I think it's not too early for us to establish connection with them, understand their thinking, where they're trying to go. So I would like to sort of emphasize to the embassy here and the Japanese business and all that, to try cultivating the sort of the new networks among the up and rising Democrats who's just joined the Congress and all that. So I'll end at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I have a couple of questions already to ask you, but I will let Shihoko make some opening remarks and perhaps touching particularly on the China-Japan dimension. That would be particularly interesting to me, but whatever you're interested in presenting, I'm happy to hear.
Well, thank you, Matt. So looking ahead, 2019, the real challenge for Japan is going to be, can it be a stabilizer in a sea of global uncertainty? And I really want to take my 5-10 minutes to talk about the political economy, especially regarding the impact of the U.S.-China trade that spills over into the global political economy. We've already heard today about the risks facing not just the United States and China in a trade war, but to the global economy writ large. But if there is a silver lining to this conflict, it is that it has actually led to a wing of relations between Japan and China. But at the same time, what Japan is doing at the moment is really having a two-pronged approach to dealing with this trade war. The first approach is to side with the United States against China and really trying to encourage China to abide by the norms of the international community, by adhering to the rules of the WTO, and also being part of a multilateral approach in ensuring that rules that have been key for growth in the post-war era continue to flourish. So that has led Japan to join forces with the United States, as well as the European Union in the WTO in taking action or against not China per se, but against non-market economies in making sure that they adhere to transparent rules, that there is restriction and ability to combat forced technology transfers, protection of intellectual property rights, regulation of state-owned enterprises, etc. That comes at a time where Japan is also taking another second approach, that is to say a more conciliatory approach with China. As Professor Nakayama has mentioned, there has been a thawing of relations between Japan and China. In October, there was the summit meeting, And the challenge, though, for Tokyo is going to be to have a decoupling of economic interests and trade relations with China on the one hand, and also acknowledging and trying to come to terms with the political as well as the strategic rivalries that it has with Beijing. I should point out, though, that the relations that Beijing and Tokyo now have go beyond the cosmetic. It isn't simply a summit diplomacy in October for the sake of a summit diplomacy, and instead of simply having another meeting in spring this year in Tokyo, there is great commitment between the second and third largest economies in the world to have what Prime Minister Abe has called moving from competition to cooperation. And this isn't an altruistic issue. It really is something that both countries see as critical in part to offset some of the risks that is being imposed by a more unilateral trade approach by the United States. But we've seen an agreement between Beijing and Tokyo to have an easing of maritime tensions. We've also seen specific roadmap for joint energy development projects, and we've seen a commitment to develop third-party country cooperation, especially in Thailand for smart city growth. That said, I have to agree with Professor Nakayama that Japan's relations with China have really started at a very low point, and the fundamental rivalries and quite frankly the mistrust continue to persist. And if we look at a poll done by Gendon, which is a nonprofit organization at the time of the Xi-Abe summit, we found that China's public sentiment on Japan has actually improved remarkably. From the nadir of very bad relations between China and Japan following the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands in 2012, we see that China, about 40% of the Chinese now have a very favorable view of Japan, and that comes in part from greater tourism and more Chinese people going to Japan and seeing firsthand what Japan has to offer. It also has a great deal to do with a more positive tone in the Chinese state media coverage over the last year or so. But what's interesting, though, is that whilst we've seen a dramatic rise in a favorable impression by the Chinese, the Japanese still continue to have a very unfavorable view, according to Gendon. Nearly 90% still say they have a very, very unfavorable or unfavorable view of China. And why is that? One of the biggest reasons that the Japanese say they have a great distrust of China is they see China as, quote unquote, a selfish power. Selfish power, that is to say that it is not committed to the global goods, that it is not an active contributor to the international community, and that it is more of that the China dream is more about imposing Chinese will and China's own standards rather than trying to have a more conciliatory, collaborative relationship with the world at large, but especially amongst Asian nations. There's also mistrust in the Japanese public about the governance system of China and the one-party rule of China as well. But this is actually precisely where Japan can actually play a considerable role in being an advocate and a leader in the international liberal order, that it does have an inherent interest and commitment to international organizations and adhering to the rule of law that we have really seen Japan taking a greater responsibility for since the advent of the Trump administration. And certainly, we've already heard today about expectations for for Tokyo in 2019, from everything from hosting the next G20 meeting with a very global agenda, also to enhance the CPTPP and expand membership for CPTPP as well. But quite frankly, that's not enough for Japan to take on the mantle of the global stabilizer. It's not enough to execute carefully and thoughtfully the plans that are already in the making. It needs to do much more to offset the insularity that we're seeing in Washington and the expansion ambitions of China. That is really because we're also seeing a seismic shift in global growth and global growth trends, and namely that comes from the challenge of the digital global economy. And we already see that issues like automation and artificial intelligence can disrupt the labor force. It has led to a lot of fear, a lot of wariness, a lot of uncertainty and anxiety in the workforce at all levels. And it's also contributed to a rise in nationalism, and especially economic nationalism. One of the issues that will really be critical for a country or countries to take leadership in is on data and privacy. And data will be really the defining power and lead to power struggles in the future, as any natural resource like oil, like air pollution right now today might have had in the past. And it will probably be a bigger source of friction in this year and the years looking ahead. But at the same time, what we do need to note is that there are clearly very different ideas about data privacy in particular, and just how valuable data can be. We're already seeing differences even amongst like-minded countries, like the United States and the European Union. This week, we've already seen France imposing a fine of almost $60 million on Google for violating some of the EU's privacy and data laws. Those kinds of frictions at a corporate level will probably increase at the national level and really impact public policy debate moving forward. There's also clearly a divide in how China perceives privacy and how Japan perceives privacy as well. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for Japan to really take the helm on that. And we've talked today extensively about TPP and its reincarnation, the CPTPP, as a force to bring countries together, like-minded countries at different levels of economic development. It is also an opportunity. It could be an opportunity also to ensure that e-commerce and the service sector side rules are actually adhered to as well. And what we are going to see, if we're to talk about the future and the immediate future, we see, for instance, a gathering of global leaders and business executives at Davos this week. As you may recall, 2 years ago, it was actually Xi Jinping who took to the stage and made a great deal of news talking about the need for the international order to come together and that there needs to be a working towards a common good. That kind of debate and discussion was, of course, met with great cynicism by the participants of Davos, but at the same time, it did raise an issue as to, on the one hand, those issues are important, and on the other hand, with the retreat of the United States and a greater reluctance of the United States to take on this leadership role in economic architecture, who can actually take on that role? Prime Minister Abe will be giving a presentation later this week at Davos. We've already heard today that there's a lot of excitement and expectation as to what Prime Minister Abe may or may not say. Certainly, there is a great deal of hunger for him to take on a greater role, to talk about interests of global goods. And within that, I think the issue of data and privacy should really take on a higher level of importance. Sure. Thank you.
Okay, great, Shihoko. You've introduced some important issues with respect to China in particular, and I want to come back again on a couple of those. But let me bring Eric into the conversation. Eric, you're particularly, I think, following the trade issues, but I'm happy to have you again talk about whatever interests you.
Thanks very much. A pleasure to join the conversation. I have the problem that you always do if you're the last speaker. Everything interesting has already been said, including by Kawai Sensei during his presentation earlier. But in terms of just looking at the year ahead, 2019, and the challenge facing Prime Minister Abe, just to pick up on a lot of the policy agenda that stands before him, if you look at how he has navigated the first 2 years of the Trump administration and advanced Japan's economic interests broadly construed in the context of all the chaos and uncertainty about the global trading system and the relationship with the U.S., he's really done a very commendable job, both in terms of building a positive relationship with President Trump, deflecting and sort of moderating U.S. demands for concessions that would address the trade deficit, which this administration is so obsessed with. But he's also done yeoman's work in exercising leadership in the region, particularly with getting TPP 11 over the finish line in the absence of U.S. participation, being a very constructive force at the WTO in working with the EU and others, WTO reform, concluding a FTA with the EU that will also provide another sort of example of the possibilities of trade liberalizing cooperative activity in the global system, even in spite of this sort of protectionist moment that we're living in. So he's accomplished a lot during this very challenging period, but we're entering perhaps an even more difficult time ahead with global growth slowing, a lot of uncertainty about China's economic trajectory that is worsened substantially by the extremely uncertain outlook for the U.S.-China trade talks, which we just heard some unfortunate news today about apparently the Trump administration refusing welcome a vice ministerial delegation to talk about terms and conditions, potentially the high-level talks at the end of this month. So that remains a huge risk factor for the global economy and one that impacts Japanese economic interests very substantially, but one that Abe and indeed most of the international community can have very little to do to create a positive outcome. So in that context, what is Abe to do? He has taken on a new challenge now with agreeing to launch the bilateral trade negotiations that are variously referred to as trade agreement in goods or U.S. Japan trade agreement. So clearly there are some substantial gaps between the understandings and aspirations of the U.S. and Japan, and this is going to be a real challenge for him. There are questions as to whether the Trump administration is prepared to adhere to the agreement that was laid out in the joint statement, that this negotiation will be primarily focused on the goods side, and that particularly in the area of agricultural liberalization, the TPP, there is tremendous ambiguity about the disposition of services and other issues in this negotiation. Phased negotiation with agreements reached on a rolling basis, potentially with early harvests, or will this be a kind of intractable, challenging negotiation because of the different visions of the two sides? And of course, as we've discussed on an earlier panel, Japan's domestic political calendar between now and July is very challenging for Abe to even give any initial signals as to what Japan might be prepared to provide in the negotiations. And then, of course, the shutdown is not helping on the U.S. side in terms of our preparations. So, but other than that, everything's going great on the bilateral side. And I listened with great interest to the, I think, relatively positive assessment of the potential to conclude the RCEP agreement this year. And I think there are certainly a lot of motivations on the Chinese side to get momentum moving. I understand that Japan has begun to become more comfortable with a perhaps lower level of ambition as developed country participants. But I think we can never fail to give India the credit it is due as being among difficult trading partners in the world in terms of what they will demand and whether it will be possible to accede to it, even template of treating them as a least developed country with long phases, et cetera. Even that may not be enough to guarantee the Indians providing their necessary level of commitments to get a possible agreement through. So I think RCEP is going to be a very big boulder to push up the hill before the end of the year. The other X factor with that is what's the U.S. perspective. I think the Trump administration has had the opportunity to remain relatively quiet on the benefits or dangers posed by RCEP. If it gets closer to being real and having a regional agreement that includes China but leaves the U.S. out, I think that becomes a more difficult thing for the Trump administration to accept, and we perhaps should expect the kind of subtle diplomacy and messaging coming out of the White House if we see a development that we don't like on that front. So I think there's some real hurdles to be overcome for Abe to play the kind of leadership role, advance Japan's interests, and contribute to stabilizing the global rules-based trading system. This is particularly the case at the WTO, where we are in the midst of a long descent into chaos and dysfunction. There has been no breakthrough that would allow us to save the dispute settlement system by the end of the year, when it will no longer have a quorum to hear cases. There have been many proposals, some of them constructive. I don't see any of them being acceptable to the U.S. at this point. Japan could certainly become more involved and work closely with the EU and others to try and reach a solution that would be acceptable to the United States. But it remains a very dangerous situation. And with the sort of multilateral trade liberalizing agenda of the WTO basically collapsing, if the dispute settlement process also completely fails and is no longer able to hear cases, I think that's incredibly worrying for the rules-based system, and something that Japan, as one of the leading supporters, will have to figure out what it can do to be constructive. But this is an example, I think, of in the absence of U.S. leadership, and in this case, U.S. willingness even to participate in crafting a solution, Japan's efforts, while critical, may be insufficient to get to the outcomes we want. But with that little dose of sunshine, maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So I have a long list of things that I want to try to cover. It's going to be very hard to do this in whatever 20 minutes or so before I turn to the audience. But it's also tempting to get into some of the deeper structural questions, like explaining why, ask Nakayama Sensei, but maybe we'll do it over a beer. Why this red state phenomenon in Japan? Because all the data points seem to suggest that not all, but many data points seem to suggest that Japan is better off with democratic administrations. That's not a political statement. That's just an observation going back to the Nixon shocks, that a lot of the problems that Japan's had in the alliance have been under Republican administrations. But that's a deeper issue. This is a 2019 conversation, so let me just zero in on a couple of things that we didn't get into that are in the news this week. Russia. So Prime Minister Abe is in Russia as we speak, and there is talk of some sort of rapprochement or possibly even a peace treaty, dramatic with respect to the 4 islands. Nakayama Sensei, do you predict that there is going to be some sort of major breakthrough in Russia this year, and what are the implications of that for the U.S. Japan alliance in particular?
I don't see any major breakthroughs. And in fact, if you read the papers, talk to experts, literally everybody, no one really understands why Prime Minister Abe seems to be confident about reaching some sort of deal. And, Russia is not a trusted sort of country in Japan as well. You have North Korea, China, and then it's like Russia. So I don't understand. It's very different from what Mr. Trump, how Mr. Trump trusts Putin, I guess. But somehow Prime Minister Abe trusts Putin. And I think they have met 25 times. That's a lot, right? And I don't see the logic, and I don't see any breakthrough happening. So the answer that what kind of implication it would have on U.S., because I don't see any breakthrough.
Others are welcome to jump in, but let me ask you, put another one on the table, which is North Korea. You talked about South Korea, and that's an important issue, that relationship. But what about North Korea? What are the risks for Abe-san with respect to North Korea? There's a group in Sweden right now, I understand, trying to negotiate on the abductees. But meanwhile, President Trump's moving ahead with his summit in probably Hanoi. I don't know if that's now been confirmed, but in February. What are the risks for Abe-san, and how is he going to manage all of that?
Right. According to our government officials, we are supposed to be fully informed of what's happening. Right? Some of our high-ranking diplomats are, always around the meeting, getting briefed by the U.S. officials. So that's the government position. So, calm down is what we hear all the time. But I think we are extremely worried. No one on the U.S. side do not completely understand what's going on. So even the high-ranking briefing by the U.S. official to the Japanese high-ranking official doesn't fully convince us. Right? The short-range and mid-range missiles maybe not on the deal. There are some issues that, like the abduction issue, that we're very much interested in. Although the public is not as, emotionally attached to the issue as a couple of years ago, but still it's a big issue. And the biggest fear is U.S. forces in ROK, and the kind of deal that President Trump might sort of make with Kim Jong-un. I don't think that's going to happen, but he's been hinting that consistently. So maybe not now, but like sort of in the future sort of arrangement, if that comes up, that would worry us a lot. But I think if that happens, there will be a revolt on the U.S. side as well. I was quite shocked about the reaction of the Republicans when Mr. Trump said he's going to retreat from Syria. You know, many of them were quiet on the domestic issues, but many came out publicly in saying that we cannot agree on that. And that might happen on the U.S. forces on ROK as well. For instance, this is just hypothetical. If Mattis, McMaster, Kelly, and Tillerson, they all come out publicly and saying that we're against President's decision, and if they somehow, out of a sense of duty, revealed what was going on in the White House, that would be a big blow to the Trump way. Kind of veered off from your question, but yeah.
There's, again, a lot more to say about either of those topics, and Chihoko, you're welcome to jump in on either of those if you'd like. But let me ask you about the China story that you raised and the notion of this more conciliatory approach by Abe-san. To what extent is that, I mean, and you touched on this, but just I want to press again on how much of this is a strategic play because, you know, China-Japan relations are obviously, you know, fundamental for Japan, and there's some longer-term play that Abe is doing, and how much is sort of more tactical, either because it's a hedge against the U.S. or because, you know, Xi Jinping is reaching out, or because, I don't know, I even heard a story that, you know, Abe's objective is to make sure that Xi Jinping comes to the Olympics in 2020, and so he's going to be nice to him until then, and then after that it's back to the normal spatting. I mean, seriously, is this just tactical or reactive, or is there some deeper kind of play here by Abe?
Before I get to the China issue, if I could just add my 2 cents on the North Korea issue. Japan still remains the only major country that does not, in the neighborhood, that has not had a summit meeting with Kim Jong-un. One of the remarkable developments of 2018 was that North Korea goes from the pariah state to the darling, and Japan has really had to scramble to readjust its position. The understanding now is that Abe would be open to a meeting with Kim Jong-un, but that interest is not really being. That will really continue to be something that Tokyo will continue to be focused on. And in the meantime, there really isn't a party that is able to carry Japan's interests. And regarding North Korea and Japan's interests are actually major concerns for regional stability and the lack of clarity about what exactly denuclearization is, what the timeline is. But at the same time, a lot of hypothetical talk about reconciliation, potential reunification, what kind of economic assistance there could be. And on the latter, there is already pressure for Japan to actually contribute to those kind of reconstruction efforts. So it's in a quagmire, and I think the situation really remains very much in flux. On the China issue, again, this is we're starting from a threshold of negative threshold going to a positive. We're going from a relationship that was very, very much acrimonious to something that is within the realm of acceptability in the region. And one of the reasons, of course, is the two sides have shared economic interests and shared economic concerns about the fallout from the persisting U.S. trade policy. But at the same time, even if there wasn't a trade dispute, such a major trade dispute and threat of tariff from the United States, China, again, we're facing a considerable slowdown in the Chinese economy, and that will continue to be a burden on the Chinese leadership. And China is not simply reaching out to Japan, it's also reaching out to India and to other countries as well. And so we will continue to see this kind of reconciliation between China, this charm diplomacy that China is moving forward with. Of course, this could turn on a dime. My concern really is this continued divide in public sentiment between Japan and China, and how that can actually be reconciled. If I could add just one anecdotal information, I was actually in New Delhi last week for a conference that was organized in part by the Indian Foreign Ministry, and at one of the one of the panel discussions was actually about the Indo-Pacific security regime, and the panelists were actually the admirals of Japan, the Quad, Japan, United States, Australia, India. The moderator was British, and there was also participation from a French admiral as well. As you can probably imagine, in a public forum in India, none of them were going to go out of their way to say anything controversial, but at the same time, it was clear that they wanted to present this unified position, speak with one voice. And what was that one voice? That one voice was to talk about the threat of China and the rise of China and the need for the Quad to actually cooperate together to take a firm position against Beijing. And that is going to be the challenge. Again, going back to what I said at the beginning, to what extent will Japan be able to decouple its relations with China, on the one hand, have strong trade and economic relations, whilst continuing to view China as a not just a strategic rival, but as a military threat as well.
Okay. Eric, just simple prediction. Is there going to be a U.S. Japan trade banana, whatever you want to call it, this year? And how does and you use a yes or no question, and then how does that, your judgment on that, affect the ability of the U.S. and Japan to positively or negatively to work on other things, first of all in the trade and economic realm, whether it's the trilateral work with the EU on the agenda of forced technology transfer and subsidization and state-owned enterprises and WTO reform, or broader things in the alliance that they could be working on other than this, which is going to take a lot of time. So, first yes or no question: is there going to be a deal or not?
Well, I guess so.
That's not yes or no.
I think the odds of an agreement of some kind that the Trump administration will claim as a victory by the end of the year are decent. Whether that is a comprehensive free trade agreement, I would say the odds of that are zero. But it really depends, as do all of these negotiations. First and foremost, what does the Trump administration really want? The Trump administration set up, the NAFTA renegotiation as if it was going to be a kind of de novo, entirely new agreement that would fix all of the ill-defined problems of NAFTA and, immediately render our trade balances even with Canada and Mexico. In the end, what you got was a kind of TPP gloss on the existing agreement with some additional protectionist elements in the auto sector. So very far from what was originally promised, in part because I think the Trump administration came to understand the depths of the resistance it was getting from virtually all U.S. economic constituencies. In the case of the U.S. ROK FTA, I think the need to maintain positive relationships with Korea in the face of the challenge of North Korea, I think, was also a moderating factor, and the desire not to have to take it back to the hill under TPA. So, just a really modest, frankly meaningless renegotiation of that agreement. So the question is that going to happen with Japan? Is it going to be kind of just getting the things that we would have gotten under TPP but lost out because of our incredibly bad decision to pull out? Or are we going to upset the apple cart and really put the screws to Abe and the Japanese using the threat of auto tariffs to get substantially greater liberalization and to impose some kind of managed trade in the auto sector, which is what it would take really to make a dent in the bilateral trade deficit. And the answer is we really don't know what the Trump administration's bottom line is. If they're prepared to be reasonable, if they're prepared to have a phased series of agreements that are within the sort of political space that Abe has available at the moment, you could certainly get the first of these agreements by the end of the year.
Yes or no? Do you think there's going to be a trade deal this year, and how does it affect the ability for the U.S. trade or elsewhere?
Well, if I could really make a very good prediction, I probably wouldn't be in this job. But
you're on this panel. You're supposed to predict. Take a wild guess.
The smart Japanese strategy, I think, postpone and delay as much as possible any bilateral that it has to do with the United States. Bear in mind that it was only until last autumn Japan really made public that it had no interest in having a bilateral deal with the United States, that it wanted to bring the United States back into the fold of TPP and pursue a multilateral approach to getting to a deal. That has been overturned, and so it's pursuing this bilateral agreement with the United States. So in light of the current, I don't want to say instability, Japan would be smart, I think, to take advantage of the fact that the United States is pursuing trade deals on multiple fronts with a lot of restrictions, some of them self-imposed, and to have this stall and delay tactic, if it can overcome 2019, we're going into an election year, and so it will be even more difficult to have a trade deal in place. So I would think that would be the strategy that would make the most sense.
Okay, Nakayama-sensei, you can also address that, but I also wanted to ask you, is this trade issue a bigger threat to the U.S.-Japan alliance in 2019 than something else? The possibility of a fallout over any of the issues we've already discussed, North Korea or Russia, or some problem in Okinawa, or just the absence of Jim Mattis, or something else that could destabilize the alliance. What's the biggest risk to the alliance this year?
Well, simply put, the biggest crisis that Japan can face is the U.S.-Japan relations sort of crumbling down, right? China is a problem. DPRK is a problem. And the whole point about U.S.-Japan alliance and the relations is to deal with those kind of situations. We know that crisis is out there. But if this basis, the root, the rock part, solid part, would sort of crumble down, that would be the biggest crisis for Japan. And what's the potential dangers in managing the U.S.-Japan relations? It's trade. So I think it is huge. And I think Prime Minister Abe and his team understands that. Well, first of all, the best that the Japanese bureaucracy is good at is the delaying tactic. And we're in a full mode of trying to, but I guess the U.S. side understands that already. So we think that part is kind of over. So we have announced that we are buying 100 more additional F-35. Right? Yes, we do need them, but is it really F-35s? There's a question mark there. But people are being sort of quiet, silent, because we kind of know what that's about. And as long as U.S.-China negotiations is not settled, I think USTR is not fully in position to deal with Japan, and it seems like it is going on. So, And Goto-san mentioned when the election season comes in, things would slow down on the U.S. side. So not a delaying tactic, that part is over, but trying to sort of, well, it is a delaying tactic, but slow down, do other things. I think that's how we're going to sort of. But the last point, if we have to do it, I think the other administration at the sort of like the TPP level. Not let U.S. put tariffs on cars, because that may ignite sort of huge negative backlash.
I'm going to bring the audience in, but before I do, so think of your questions. But let me just ask one final question that at least in my mind, sort of links the economic and the strategic, which is whether there is a tension between Japan's more conciliatory approach towards a specific initiative of China's, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, and the interest in working together to find projects and so forth, which is part of the warming of the two countries. Between that and the U.S. Japan interest in the free and open Indo-Pacific, which in the U.S. case seems to largely focus on pushing back against Belt and Road, or at least offering an alternative to Belt and Road. In terms of the content of the free and open Indo-Pacific, there isn't a lot else at the moment other than trying to find some alternative to Belt and Road. Is there any tension there in the relationship for anybody down the line? You can start.
Simple. We're going to do both. Be tough and try to sort of cooperate with China at the same time. And managing that is, I think, the toughest task that Japanese diplomacy has at the moment. We were urging U.S. to be tough on China. The situation now is that, be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. And there might be a moment where U.S. becomes too tough on China and we sort of back down. So many people, although we're very skeptical about China's rise, that you see this kind of discourse or narrative rising in Japan, that Japan has to play the role of a mediator. Not neutral, right? We're on the U.S. side, but try to calm down the situation. But at the same time, we have to be tough on China. So that's the delicate position Japan is trying.
I agree that Japan has to do both insofar as it has to be part. It is really on a project-by-project basis, opportunities both in Belt and Road as well as in the Pacific. Bear in mind there is a huge infrastructure investment gap that even if both plans were to materialize in full, that still wouldn't meet the gap that is needed in Asia and as well as in Latin America and Africa. Japan remains a powerhouse in investments in Latin America and Asia. It also provides quality financing. That kind of quality over quantity will really continue to define Japan's aid effectiveness. That should be the road.
Just one word on that. I think the Japanese strategy on both the Indo-Pacific and Belt and Road is very sensible. They have been somewhat more enthusiastic about the Indo-Pacific, a little more cautious on supporting the Belt and Road. But in both cases, I think the true incentive of the Japanese government is to avoid creating problems in the China or U.S. relationships. And they view sort of collaboration on infrastructure projects, either under the Indo-Pacific and particularly under the Belt and Road, as highly problematic for a lot of very sensible reasons. And there's going to be less that meets the eye with both in terms of Japan's collaboration. There'll probably be more going on, and maybe even more going on in the Indo-Pacific, even though it's a concept that lacks substance, just because of the serious problems of actually doing collaboration with China on many of these projects, so many of which have run into problems with recipient governments. So I think they're being positive but cautious and balancing it pretty well.
All right, I'm going to ask folks in the audience, if you have a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. Okay, right up here in the front and then way in the back after that.
My question is, U.S. Japan trade bilateral trade negotiation, and related to the Kawai Sensei's keynote speech, and looking at the agreements between among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico for USMCA, one of the problematic rules is it's actually tries to kind of prevent any country from concluding a trade agreement with China, and you can guess that that might, U.S. may raise the same demand to Japan during bilateral trade negotiation. But if this happens, it will make RCEP not work, and it will make it impossible to expand TPP into China. And so, Kawai Sensei's argument of using TPP for encouraging China for reform, that would not work. So how do you think should Japan try to dodge that kind of demand from from the U.S.?
But the poison pill provision, agree with the premise that USTR is probably going to ask Japan to adopt something like that. And how does Japan respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great example of, the Trump administration laying out an extremely tough policy demand that the Canadians and the Mexicans clearly didn't care that much about. They had bigger fish to fry in getting that agreement done and avoiding the disaster that it would pose if NAFTA collapsed. But this is, potentially quite problematic for Japan with regard to RCEP. So whether the U.S. is prepared to put Abe in that kind of a difficult position, in addition to all the sensitivities involved in the negotiation beyond that, is a great question. And whether the U.S. thinks that it can make all of its trading partners choose between deepening economic ties with the U.S. and freezing them with China. That historically has been something that nobody in the region wants the U.S. to do. There's no reason to think they are any more enthusiastic about that U.S. demand now, particularly given how utterly unreliable we are. So that to me sounds like picking a fight that is not in our interest or in Japan's interest. But if we don't make that demand, if the U.S. doesn't make that demand, people will say, why is it in USMCA and not in the Japan agreement? So I think it's a gigantic headache. I think it's going to be problematic for Japan. And it's, just another reason this negotiation is going to be a complete nightmare.
Can I just add? Bear in mind, it doesn't say China per se. It's non-market economy. So one way that could skirt this issue could be to define a non-market economy, perhaps a wording of non-market economy in transition, and what China is trying to itself. But pedantics aside, I completely agree with Eric. It is a tremendous problem, and Japan will ought to do its utmost to avoid having this clause in. Another perhaps way to avoid it impacting RCEP is to say, not in negotiating with non-market economies moving forward, i.e. that existing current negotiations won't be impacted, and it would only be for again, this boils down to a question of words and the stance that the Trump administration is something that really it does more harm than good in forging alliances.
Okay, thanks. There was a hand way in the back. Please identify yourself.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jung from Radio Free Asia. Question about the North Korea. Despite of the upcoming second summit, U.S. and North Korea, but still the fully denuclearization is going to be a long way and still skeptical at this time. But at this time, that maybe the couple things could be agreed, U.S. and North Korea, for example, the ICBM, dismantling the ICBM, something like that. But that one is not enough for the Japanese government, I think. You mentioned short range and long range, short range, middle range missile is still the threat to the Japan now. But I want to ask you that what Japanese government can ask to the Trump administration to maximize Japanese own national interest?
Well, I guess we'd have to ask the Trump negotiation team to be, tough on North Korea, include short and mid-range missiles in the negotiations. Although the term maximum effort is almost gone, that we have to keep on emphasizing putting pressure to a certain degree. But if it all doesn't work out, we'd have to do the negotiation ourselves, I guess. Short and mid-range missiles are not a direct threat to the United States. Of course, that would, shake, Japanese trust towards the U.S. to a certain degree. But, we'd have to sort of take care of the situation ourselves. I think in order to do that, there is a willingness on the Japanese side in the leadership that there has to be some kind of direct talks with the North Korean side in order to sort of prepare for that kind of situation. So I think that's the only way to go, I think.
Mindy Reiser, Global Peace Services USA. This is a panel on foreign policy, and I'm curious what you can tell us about Japanese policy towards some contested parts of the world. For example, the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian dispute, challenges in Austria, Poland, and Hungary in terms of the direction of the governments. Is Japan really trying to stay away from saying very much? Is it working behind the scenes? I'm curious what impact the shifts in policies in some of these areas have on Japanese diplomacy.
It's a good question because we've focused a lot on, not just today, but in the last couple of years in looking at Abe's foreign policy on the Indo-Pacific region and what he's doing there. But what about these other challenges in the world? If Japan's going to step up and play more of an assertive role, these are important issues that it should be involved in. Is it interested? Is it involved?
I don't know if I have the expertise to fully answer to your question, but although Japan is not a superpower, we'd like to see ourselves as a country with a global scope, interested in various issues. So I said that we doubled down on the Trump administration, U.S. Japan alliance and all that, but at the same time, we're a strong supporter of Paris Agreement. EU, EPA, TPP 11, JCPOA, although we're not a member of that, we strongly support that. So we are very interested in maintaining the global norms. So I'm sure the embassy will like this. I'm saying this, but I wasn't particularly in favor of Japan withdrawing from the IWC. I'm going to say a bit quiet. International Whaling Commission, if you don't like it, just pull out. I don't think that was right, but there are some political reasons for that, and all the countries have those kind of issues. But that putting that aside, I think we are very much interested in playing the role of like Goto-san said, you used the word sort of stabilizer, stabilizer, right? But the region that we're living in is so dynamic and dangerous, right? So honestly speaking, I think we're preoccupied with our region and directly, actually Japan doing something. So when there was a talk about peace and security legislation in 2012-13 period, there was many elements, according to the sort of the recommendation, there were lots of part mentioning about Japan playing a more bigger role in collective security. in UN operations and all that. But that sort of faded out because we live in a tough region. We have to take care of ourselves first. So that mentality is surely there. But in abstract, we're interested in becoming a country with a global scope. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we play an active role in condemning the Saudi for the Khashoggi murder or anything like that.
And still have aspirations to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council.
Officially, we do. The Prime Minister, I believe, announces it in the UNGA every year. I think the prospects of it is getting dimmer. But because I still think, the phrase that Yoichi Funabashi sort of coined, a global civilian power, is I think the right model that Japan should pursue. That doesn't mean we're not going to focus on security and all that. But the kind of image that we have of ourselves, I think the term global civilian power, although it's an old term, I think it still fits. And becoming a member of, a permanent member of UN sort of fits into that. So we're still pursuing that, but that's the momentum itself is kind of, not on the Japanese side, but the whole reform process itself. Post-Trump administration is followed
in championing that.
UN reform. Right.
UN reform. Okay. Actually, I should mention, if it hasn't been mentioned already today, if I missed it, that Japan is hosting its 5th or 6th TCAD meeting, the Africa conference this year, one of the many summits it's doing this year. And so it does, at least on issues that are, more distant than its immediate neighborhood, try to play a role in that sense. But on those issues, don't see as much involvement. Okay. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. There's a woman there. There may be one more after that, and then we should probably wrap up, right, Jim?
Hi, Chia Ching with United News Group Taiwan. Just a question. The Taiwan government has been expressing the will to join CPTPP. What does Taiwan have to do to gain other countries' support, especially Japan? Thank you.
Let me ask Eric to answer that question, but then if I can just add a part B to that question, a corollary, which is it time for the U.S. to consider a bilateral FT, whatever, because it probably can't be called an agreement or whatever, with Taiwan?
Since the first question wasn't hard enough, you had to make it 10 times as hard. On the easier of the two questions, on Taiwan's interest in TPP, I think the problem is that China is willing to invest considerable political and diplomatic resources to deterring TPP members from welcoming Taiwan into TPP. The U.S., of course, is no longer part of this decision-making process. But I do think China would pull out all the stops to get TPP members to understand that China would seek to punish champions of Taiwan's inclusion. Obviously, I don't agree at all with that position taken by China, but I think we should expect that. And as I think Kawai-sensei mentioned earlier, maybe a more likely model, if you think about WTO accession and APEC membership and other things of that kind, would be a kind of joint entry, China and Taiwan entering TPP at the same time as one potential way of coming at the problem and limiting the blowback. Obviously, that delays this prospect very substantially. So, but I hope I'm wrong about that, but I'm not sure TPP 11 members want to deal with the blowback from the Chinese on that. But, maybe they will be prepared to do that. And then on the U.S.-Taiwan FTA or economic agreement side, it's interesting. Partly there's the bandwidth question, but I certainly think, especially given the Trump administration's willingness to create problems in the U.S.-China relationship, it ought to be a more permissive environment to explore the possibility of a bilateral trade agreement. I think that we still have the agricultural politics that have been such a stumbling block in U.S.-Taiwan trade relations for many years, including on beef and pork. So I think Taiwan would need to make a very strong case and have strong allies, particularly in the ag community in the U.S., and see where you could get. I mean, I think it would be well worth trying, and I think Taiwan should bring an ambitious package to the table to see if the Trump administration would be willing to take it up.
Okay, well answered. Any final burning?
Sorry, Can I just add to the Taiwan question? I was in Taipei in December, and what struck me was not only at meetings at the Trade and Economic Ministries, but also in the Affairs Council, at the National Security Council, at all levels, there's this whole issue of the national Taiwan's interest to join CPTPP and to have a bilateral trade agreement with the United States, that it is more than an economic interest, it really is a security necessity as well. That said, this is something that's going to be negotiated on a trade ministry basis, and whilst the Taiwan's position in the international arena has become increasingly challenging over the last year or so, the negotiators are going to be focused on the economic issues. And as Eric said, some of the issues that remain sticking points in this remain unchanged, not just from the Trump administration, but during the Obama administration and before that. And so whilst there is recognition of Taiwan's interest to pursue this, it will be difficult unless Taiwan is really able to significant concessions on pork in particular. And I'm not sure whether that kind of interest has really been expressed on the Taiwanese side. One thing that could help Taiwan, I believe, is whether or not there is a final deal or not, a formal expression of both sides, both the United States and Taiwan, to have some kind of trade, formalized trade deal would help Taiwan in raising its stake and its foothold in the international arena. So that could be one step that it could pursue in the future.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but I'm going to ask one more quick lightning round question to everybody on the panel, which is, we mentioned the G20, we mentioned TCAD, but Rugby World Cup. To which point will Japan's team reach? Will it win? Will it get to the final? Will it get to the semifinal, the quarterfinal? Nakayama-san, go.
We were never really good at it, but there are some hopes. We don't know whether we will win, but at least we're in a position that we can compete.
Quarterfinal, semifinal?
Finals.
Finals. All right. We have a prediction. Anybody else want to stick their neck out?
Okay, so I went to graduate school at Waseda, and Waseda University has the strongest rugby team in Japan. Therefore, I'm very solid.
Some would disagree.
Waseda has the best rugby team in Japan, full stop. And I am a fan of the Waseda rugby team. I am a fan of the Japanese rugby team. I know nothing about the rules, and I don't know how you win, but hey, definitely the semifinals just because.
Eric, want to stick your neck out?
Japan all the way.
Yeah, win. There we go. We have okay. We'll invite you back next year, and we'll check on that prediction among the others. But terrific panel. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thanks. And again, before Jim wraps up, let me say on behalf of the Japan America Society of Washington, thanks to the Carnegie Endowment, thanks to NAJAZ, thanks to all of you for coming. We really appreciate your support and your attention so late in the afternoon. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Matt. I couldn't say it better myself, so I will leave it there. Thanks to all of you for coming out. This concludes our Japan in 2019. It's been a full day, very productive day, and that's thanks to all of our panelists and speakers and to your participation as well. Thank you very much.